the idea of the nails on chalkboard.
All right. So you had a long podcast with Jim Rudd, and you and I and many other people have been having a series of conversations around these concepts on Twitter. And to be perfectly frank, my sense of it is that two things. One, I think the concepts that you're working on, and here I'm specifically talking about the concept of binding closure. I think you're calling the other one exploring closure, exploratory closure, or something like that. We'll maybe get.
Yeah, I mean, like I think like more technically, like catalytic is probably
Okay.
accurate, but
So binding
exploratory,
closure and catalytic closure.
yeah. But I have like in the Rut conversation, I definitely was saying exploratory because we're kind of talking about that explore exploit.
Yeah.
And there is a sort of mapping between those. Yeah.
And then so one is kind of getting those concepts clarified, and then ultimately carefully mapping them then to this question of what's going on in the, let's call it just the crypto space for the moment, proof of work, proof of stake. Right? So that's the distinction. You guys went over that. My sense is that it didn't get to the point that it needed to get to. So I want to try really hard to really get clarity on exactly what the key concepts are in their most fundamental sense, and then do the mapping also with a very high degree of clarity and with as many examples as necessary. So what I want to do is I want to capitulate to you what I think is being said, and then we'll maybe iterate back from there. And so you are identifying, and for the moment, I don't want to worry about citations or references or anybody else, just focusing on the ideas. So you're identifying a distinction between two classes of closure, which is to say of processes and systems that have the characteristic that they create feedback loops whereby the output of the system reproduces the system in some kind of relatively stable fashion. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're like, and this can be even in the sense that, like, even think of a simple mechanism that has to repeat its process as it functions. Like even an internal combustion engine, for example, could be looked at as a functional closure in the sense that it has to end where it started to begin the next cycle, right? So, yeah.
All right. So, and
that becomes important when you start talking about like binding between two domains versus trying to encapsulate
exactly.
or generate. Yeah.
And we're gonna get to that notion of binding between, and then sort of exploring within, which seems to be one of the fundamental parts. So if I have like the left-hand side and the right-hand side, category class 1 and class 2. Class 1 has this sense or this characteristic of binding between. It has a characteristic also you mentioned of either opening and holding open a portal, which is very similar to that binding between. And of this notion of exploit, which is to say just entering into new. And so those are all elements that seem to be stacked in class 1. Class 2 has this,
or like also like with the exploit, just like predictably and linearly generating some sort of affordance output, right? Like that predictability of that relationship, even agnostic of its greater macro implications, so to speak. Is that, and like this is also why we have that today, especially this kind of negative connotation around exploit, because of the fact that like high attention or focus on that local regularity or necessity or function, and if you really ramp it up, have deleterious side effects within some enclosed context. But yeah.
All right. So we're gonna bounce around in that area a lot. And so just hold that piece on predictability and regularity. And I would even say almost like, well, I want to violate my own premises. So we'll stay there for a little bit. Okay, second class 2. This has the characteristic of explore within. It has the characteristic of internal consistency and then some kind of discovered external constraint, something like that. It hangs together with itself. And then whatever kind of binding it has with the exterior, one is discovered ex post facto or in the exploration process, and 2 is kind of a weak binding.
You could say like not driven, perhaps. Or like people like Robert Rosen would say like it actually, that closure essentially closes that system from efficient causality is another way of thinking about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then Yeah, and there's I don't see a parallel between that and the regularity. So let's just hold that for a moment. We'll explore both, but the first one I want to explore more closely because it feels like that's the particular that requires us to really get clear and strong. Because of course the argument on the other side of the equation is saying proof of work. Right? Why is that actually a thing that we should be really, really, really focusing on with more energy and intensity than we have been, and intelligence, right? For the up till now. All right. So focusing on the notion of binding closure, and you've given examples of the mitochondria, given examples of ribosome, and photosynthesis. So, like, walk me through the particulars, and what I really want to focus on in this notion of binding across,
Mhm.
and maybe the notion of opening up a portal into a very large territory, a large adjacent possible.
Mhm.
And we can also, and then we'll probably spend some time particularly focusing on the examples. And one of the propositions I'm going to put forward is that in addition to things like regularity, there's also something like almost like maximum simplicity in the relevant context. It's almost like the lowest, it'll ultimately you're finding the lowest energy state in some kind of well, it may in fact always be in relationship with energy, but I'm just throwing that out there as a hypothesis. All right, so
Hard to get out of relationship with energy.
it kind of is, right? So if you're speaking about like in the binding closure, some of the concepts you're coming up with are things like fundamental, like you're looking at fundamentals, irreducibles, things like that, right? So if you look at the way that a mitochondria works, like okay, we have a basic problem, which is we metabolic processes, even sort of cellular processes in general, not just metabolic processes like DNA replication, require energy. Okay, so we have a basic problem. We need to find a way to bring energy into these processes. So that's the core question. Now I can take a map, like an XY map, and say, okay, I'm going to throw out all the different ways that you could bring energy into a cellular process. Like I could just sort of stochastically have every cellular process have to pull glucose from its environment and independently convert that into the energy necessary for the cellular process. Yep, could work. Super stupid, right? So the idea is now what I get effectively what is the fitness landscape, or if I'd like to do it the other direction, I can have it as kind of like an attractor landscape of which various solutions to the basic problem of bringing energy into cellular processes are good solutions. And I find myself ultimately noticing that there's a very, very, very particular point that goes way down in terms of the depth of its suitability to that function, which is the conversion of glucose into ATP. And then, of course, ADP, ATP, ADP, ATP. And I look at that and go, well, shit, that's actually super, super good because it produces a highly fungible, easily transportable, high energy transformation, relatively easy to move in and out of, suitable for almost all cellular energy functions. And by the way, the ADP or the AP piece of it, phosphorus is also useful, and adenosine is also useful. All right, so a metabolic process, the mitochondria, that finds this thing that uses that generically converts ambient sugar into ATP is sort of the best possible answer to the question of how do I provision energies to cellular processes. And so that's like my first order explanation of what's going on there, trying to use that as a way of buttressing the way that you describe it.
Yeah, and there's, I mean, one conceptual, one important conceptual piece relates to the transformation that's occurring, right? Because there's a kind of ambient gradient that's being tapped into that would not itself be usable by the kind of processes that are on the other side of that binding, right? Like the reason why you're basically taking a kind of energy gradient that's an ambient energy gradient and then encoding that and those asymmetries into like a molecular structure that has sufficiently generic affordances that it can provide that energy in a number of new contexts, right?
I'm going to say this in a different language. So in the example, the ambient energy gradient has to do with the fact that there's in sugars, glucose, etc., there is a potential energy that could be made use of to do work in cellular processes. but the ability to bring that potential energy into actual use in cellular processes is, call it, very, very hard. If I interpose a step between that of converting those various sugars into ATP, it now gets very, very easy. And that difference is the thing that the mitochondria is particularly doing. Is that
and it's provided with like simultaneously, like that fitness landscape you're talking about, the provision of that energy has to find this balance between the capacity to transfer the energy efficiently, but then also maintain sort of genericity or generality. Because if the molecule is too specific, right, then it dramatically narrows the domain of emergent exploration that could be possible via that molecule as energy source.
All right. So in some sense, we can even use the language of design. Now we're talking, ultimately, there's actually a design criteria. We can identify them up here, like looking at it as humans. We say, well, here's a set of design criteria of what is the right answer to this question. There's some large number. We apply all those design criteria. We're like, oh, here's the location on that space called, the mitochondria producing ATP. And then, of course, evolution had to discover that solution using the evolutionary process. It didn't have the advantage of being able to look at it from up high. But that's the thing. All right, now explain to me or use the language of binding across in this example.
I mean, it's kind of exactly what we've been talking about with respect to the ability. So across means that there are at least two fundamental spaces we're talking about, right? And the two fundamental spaces, you could think of one as the input domain, or the domain of like a previously like stable pattern in the world or a stable flow in the world. And you could basically then say that you have a generic energy gradient encoded in that sugar, right? But then you have to find a mechanism that's able to sort of lift that into some other space that at least provides the toolkit required to begin experimenting in that new space. So that's this process of evolution. You can call it evolution, but really, in a lot of ways, it's a set of experimental pseudo-random bumping into one another and seeing what sticks, like literally, like what actually finds or forms a closure there with respect to the innate properties of the different atoms and molecules that are potentially involved, right? And this is very clear when you actually look inside a cell. And we like to strip away all the complexity and stochasticity, but there's a lot of crazy bumping into each other going on in there. And so there's some little stable regimes that have carved out a niche for themselves that might exist for whatever reason in the world. This is pretty, when people talk about the origin of the mitochondria or try to figure out how it evolved, there's all sorts of interesting theories about what that stability, like what that stable location in the geological history of our planet was, like whether it was ponds that, near volcanic ponds that had like an annealing process of drying out and getting wet and drying out and getting wet and creating these like layered compartmentalized structures that meant that there were stable energy gradients, or whether it was like a volcanic heat source that provided that initial regime of stable energy to be transferred into a new space of molecular complexity. But the whole point is that at some point, a mechanism that found closure with itself was able to have a byproduct that became an affordance, right? That ATP affordance.
Yep.
Then enabled whatever, it became a new niche for exploration. It became a new mechanism by which the properties of that affordance could be brought into the combinatoric milieu, right? The domain in which the new adjacent possible was open, right?
All right. So let me. So what we're having in some sense is we've got a domain or one regime, which I think, as you're describing it, is actually ultimately at this point some way that energy is being provisioned. It's coming. In some, it could be, as you said, it could be a thermal gradient as a result of volcanic activity. As it turns out, stored energy at the molecular level in sugars turns out to be the most sort of available stable answer. But there's sort of like a set of things over here that is something over, and over here, we have the exploration of this thing called cellular stuff. Like, shit, we can do cellular stuff, but to do cellular stuff, we need a pretty significant non sort of stochastic input of energy.
Yeah. Well, you can at least, I mean, the interesting thing is like, it's not even necessarily cellular stuff in the sense that like the discussion about it became cellular stuff that seems to be a sort of like a property of that endosymbiotic move in which the mitochondria was internalized inside of, protocellular structures, right? Like before that, the mitochondria just had a byproduct. Right? It wasn't necessarily internalized in a closure that increased the probability that it became intracellular experimentation, right?
Well, I'm actually, so when I say cellular stuff, what I'm trying to refer to is what is this domain? And we're talking about basically organic, the notion of organic, the movement from the chemical regime into the organic.
Anything that can take advantage of the sort of like wrapping up of energy in the conformations of that molecule.
Exactly. So there's like a progressive over some long period of time discovery of phenomena that are strictly molecular that can take advantage of an ambient, somewhat meaningful energy gradient. This creates a very large number of different things. As these things are doing what they're doing, so this is layer 2, and this is layer 1. Layer 1 is all the different sources of how how an energy gradient is presented into that molecular environment. This then begins to discover the category that we now refer to as life, or the biology. As it's doing that, it keeps discovering different locations in its own conformation, the way that it finds and makes use of energy, which is exploring different mappings over here. Like there's probably a whole category of life that did nothing but optimize for figuring out how to deal with volcanic vents, right? But suddenly one hits here, right? Which is, of course, the mitochondrion. Mitochondrion says, hey, check this shit out. I can actually take molecules known as sugars, and I can convert them into very stable, very simple, highly fungible molecules called ATP. And all these molecules over here that we're looking for an input go, fuck, that's a good input. Click, right? Now that's that binding closure. The whole system now just settles right there. Click, good, not just good answer, in some sense, best answer, right?
Well, especially to the extent that there becomes, a dependency, right? Upon, one domain upon that previous domain, right? Like the emergent domain, once the functions there come to fundamentally depend, and especially if they then facilitate whatever the inputs of the previous domain are, or whatever that gradient is, like if they can actually not only take from that gradient, but also help to reproduce it in whatever their own outputs might be, even if that's just giving their own energy back after they decompose, whatever that might be, to the extent that they create that dependency then is what serves to sort of like, people will say like freeze that in place, but it creates it makes it much more likely that the path dependency will include that mechanism in any of its further ramification or explorations. Yeah.
All right. So that, to me at least, feels relatively clear as an example of this category binding closure. Do we want to do the same thing in a different example, like ribosomes, or maybe even like slightly more upstack like language?
So this is actually okay. So there's a couple interesting things here. So the like when you bring information to the mix, like that's a huge part of the transformation of the conversation into the ribosome question, or the Bitcoin question or language. But there's also, like, I've been thinking about this example and how to perhaps provide like a simpler, more human scale example of the story of relationship between binding closure or binding mechanism and the domain of the kind of exploration that happens in the domain that opens, the adjacent possible, and why those are non-equivalent.
Okay.
If you're interested in going into that, like it would be the first time I've like tried to go into this particular. It'd be just an example of a water wheel. I don't know if you're.
All right, let's go. Let's try that example. Water wheel.
let's try it out. Let's just explore it and we'll see what comes up. But so the reason I bring that up is because, it's at, first of all, it's at the human scale. So we can kind of intuitively understand it without having any specialized knowledge or using jargon associated with specific fields. But, a water wheel, like, what is it doing, right? It's an object that, and this is kind of related to your design space, because we come at this actually from the top down perspective, even it was a human artifact, we created it.
Yeah, we made it.
But so the water wheel is, it gives us the ability to take advantage of this flow generated by, a potential energy gradient, right? And like, there's a lot of reasons why water flows, but let's just say, the primary one here is, this gravitational tendency, right? And, this whole entire
water flows,
right? And so how can you perhaps transposition or transpose or lift that flow into a novel domain of potential that looks quite a bit different than just a predictable water flow? Well, one way is to induce or create this mechanism in between, which would be something like a water wheel. The interesting thing about a water wheel is it's actually, the cyclic aspect of it is baked into its structural design, right? Because every time it turns a little bit, it's still back in contact with the water at like an initial position, right? So it's this continuous cycle. It's a very simple archetypal example of a cycle that's in contact with this gradient, but then that's transferred along a separate axis into a rotational energy, right?
Yep.
Or a rotational process. And that rotational process is a kind of function that doesn't exist. I mean, it's directly driven by the energy flow of the water, but it doesn't exist. That rotational energy or that rotational movement doesn't exist in the water flow itself. That's added to the world by the creation of the water wheel and the placement of the water wheel in that river.
Yep.
And the interesting thing about that is that, then you can tap into, and this is where this free energy concept comes into play, because that mechanism has a specific embodied capacity to transfer energy for work, which is quite literally this available free energy of the available free energy that specific mechanism allows you to tap into, right? Yep. Which is not the entire free energy of the river, of the flowing water, but it is the part that you're siphoning off. And so then you think about like the people around that and how they might use this, the product of this water wheel, right? So this is where we're kind of getting to this binding. This transfer, right?
So just slow down, I'm going to pause for a second. So because you just described up to the point of binding closure, I see, or the first category. First category is I have an ambient gradient of potential energy in the form, in this case, of water flow that has a whole bunch of characteristics, most of which are actually not useful to people. It's wet. It's random. I engage a new kind of transformer, which is in this case the water wheel, which is designed in such a way that it is able to tap into the maximum amount of the potential energy of the water flow, but does a transformation on that into a novel form that has a new set of characteristics and affordances. So it's opening up a field of potential on the basis of this combination of a new set of affordances and characteristics and a new and a source of potential energy. Right. So now I've moved through the portal. Right. That's the portal. I'm now sitting on a portal which has this a bunch of these characteristics. And by the way, as you said, they're stable. Like I can build water wheels all day long, and they're all going to output the same basic set of dynamic characteristics. So now it becomes a foundation upon which category 2, the explore function, can begin to say, okay, what can I do with that set of affordances and potentials?
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of like they don't even necessarily have to think about anything on the other side, because all they have to do is look at that rotational capacity that's being provisioned, right? That affordance, that new affordance, and then ask, well, how can I use that? And potentially, how can I relate that to whatever I need to or want to achieve that's relevant to whatever processes that I'm interested in? And so, like, we could say that, for example, let's say someone grows wheat, and that person looks at it and says, oh, I can hook this into a device that allows me to transfer that energy into processing that wheat into flour, right? Okay, so now we have one byproduct being used from that binding mechanism to produce a flow of a new higher order resource in a stable way that doesn't require as much variable human input and energy that would have to come from somewhere else, who knows, hunting or growing food in some other way, being consumed at a much less efficient rate because humans also have to use that energy for their own maintenance. Okay, so flour is one byproduct. Let's say someone has milk from their cows and they want to hook that into an automation process for a butter churning device. Okay, so now you have a butter output, right? Let's say that someone gets really creative and says, okay, well, we also need water, and I'm really sick of using buckets to carry it all around. I'm actually going to use a water wheel to generate a pump mechanism to help provision more water through, you know, this system as well. Right? Okay, so we have these flows that are coming directly from this binding mechanism, but then you can combine those with other flows in the ambient cultural milieu, like that intracellular space. Perhaps there's like an egg flow and an oven flow.
Well, there's definitely a mill, right? A saw.
Saw flow, right? Which can help prevent or create, you know, a lot of this infrastructure, as well as potentially, you know, people, you know, provisioning raw energy for powering fires. You put all those things together, you got your, you know, you got your eggs, your butter, your flour, your water, your heat. Like, you can make loaves of bread more effectively, right? And interestingly enough, like, not only can you do that in one place, the energy gradient makes it much easier for all of those entities in question to then be willing to trade amongst themselves, so they can sort of start fractally reproducing the bread creation act in their own culture, which also gives them a more stable platform for whatever they might want to collectively go and do as a emergent organism themselves.
This is a good example. This is a very good example. We're going to hold that as sort of a cardinal example. I want to throw one thing that occurred to me into the mix. I think expands the example in a useful way. And then I'm interested in trying to pop over to something that has more information as part of the example. You can add that to the toolkit. All right. So, you know, I'm sitting there and I see a water wheel, and I'm looking at it going, that's cool. I like that. I'm going to do one in wind, which is not the same kind of thing, right? That's actually, I'm taking the fundamental pattern of water wheel. I'm actually abstracting that from a particular gradient, in this case, water, noticing that I'm actually using the pattern and applying it to a different gradient, in this case, wind. That particular concept is going to become useful in a moment when we ultimately get over to the crypto space. All right. So what's an example that we can play with that very specifically brings energy? Oh, all right. Hold on for a second. I want to finish. We notice if we take a look at the particular pattern of water wheel, there will always be an exploration of that space until effectively we have settled on the most efficient variation on the theme. Now, you can imagine in the beginning, for example, it wasn't a wheel. It was like 3 buckets. You're like, well, that fucking work. Like, we need actually, but then somebody's like, well, what if I did 48,000 buckets? Well, they don't need, like, so there's like this whole process of finding what is ultimately sort of like the most compact set of patterns.
Like a parsimony seeking function to some extent.
Exactly. Okay, so that's
which is also why the mitochondria got stripped of almost all of its genes.
Exactly, right? So this is that's another characteristic of what happens there. This notion of parsimony, regularity, seems to be fundamental to this particular phenomenon, right? This binding closure characteristic. Okay, let's move into this thing where information is added to the equation.
Okay, so information added to the equation. This is I would say, okay, so, you know, of the broader category of binding closures, you know, you have to then look at the subspace of binding closures in which, you know, the two sides of that, on the input side of that, you have a very particular kind of gradient. And that gradient is no longer just a, you know, the gradient is no longer just a, I don't want to use too much jargon, but like the sort of, the sort of orthograde tendencies, or just the tendencies of a natural process to create a gradient in your environment. It's not something that is sort of stochastic or you know, when you start coming into information, like the reason that if we came across an inscribed tablet on Mars, this would be interesting to us, is because the sequential patterning and inscription of information or generation of information reflects a highly improbable artifact that almost by necessity implies some very complex negentropic process or order producing process that itself was able to output or encode or inscribe that order into a sequence, right?
Yep.
And so we're already starting at a place where we're assuming a bunch of that kind of stuff has to exist in whatever that input space is. And then we're also now asking this question of, well, what is the gradient in question? And there's this really interesting relationship between.
Pause. I want to slow down there and explicate. So what you're pointing out, and I happen to be sitting in sort of a forest, you're pointing out that the ambient environment is largely made up of two classes of experiential phenomena. There are experiential phenomenon that have a stochastic, or let's say a random or entropic signal or characteristic. And then there's these others, like I hear birds.
Yeah, and that's the orthograde, like flowing from, that tendency to flow in a way driven by a naturally entropic tendency.
Yeah, so our flowing river, right? If I just think about the sound of flowing water has a very specific sound. That sound is exactly the same mapping to every, what'd you call it,
orthograde. I mean, that's the Terence
right.
Deacon's like Deaconian way of
the sound of leaves rustling in the wind, the sound of shows the ambient sounds, which by the way, as humans, we don't pay much attention to. As you said, what's interesting? Why is something interesting? Mm-hmm. If I hear suddenly the sound of a branch crack, or I hear definitely the sound of a bird sing, I'm aware of the
like the branch, or like a branch cracking in a regular cadence.
In a regular fashion, right? If I hear like, well, fuck, that ain't this other category. This is a different kind of thing. So so the fundamental point is there's a different kind of thing. Now, when I am dealing with that different kind of thing, we happen to know, we can just say that different kind of thing requires certain kinds of, we're going to say them patterns or phenomena or processes that produce them. Right? So now we're beginning to focus in on that subset. So in the notion of the kinds of binding closures, some portion of binding closures are stochastic, right? They're kind of orthograde. I can't remember.
I mean, the ability to notice that kind of the artifact in the world depends on the existence of something that's able to move uphill against entropy, at least locally.
There you go. All right. Yeah. All right. So keep going there. So we've got that. So that's the core language. There's a distinction in the world between things that everything moves downhill. Some things are able to temporarily move uphill. Those are interesting things. Okay. So now, all right. So we're looking at binding closures that are of that category.
And interestingly enough, so that's why, generally speaking, if you think about energy and information, there's a reason why the equations of thermodynamics map so directly over to, it's right. This is where our initial information intuitions and encodings came from. For better and worse, there are some limitations on that, but understanding the domain of energy in terms of probabilities of structural patterns to exist or to dissipate, right? Like that concentration or moving up that gradient to less likely configurations in that overall configuration space is fundamentally what undergirds our current understanding and definition of information quantity. Right.
Right.
And the interesting thing about this is that there's this relationship, I would posit, that previous entailment relation that I said, in the sense that like viewing a byproduct that constitutes information in the universe implies an earlier process to some extent that was able to act against entropy, at least locally.
Yep.
The thing about that is that process that's able to act against entropy locally, if one of its byproducts is an artifact, to some extent it impresses itself on that artifact, and to some extent that impression implicitly encodes a recipe, so to speak, for reproducing the process of moving uphill against entropy. And the interesting thing about that impression is that impression can be generated on a sequence, on an artifact, without anything necessarily being able to parse it on the other side. now we get into this interesting question of, okay, now there are certain kinds of mechanisms that creates a niche for a new kind of binding mechanism that can actually usefully do something with whatever that sequence of information is, with whatever that informational encoding is. It can lift it into a new domain of exploration that is essentially, you can look at it as a decoding function, right? So you can almost look at, and this is where this ribosomal example comes in, because you can look at, this and the exact origin of our, these sequence nucleic acids and how they encode information. It's still opaque to us exactly how that occurred, but what we can say at least is that to some extent these sequential impressions, encodings of information, at some point had to be a byproduct of something, right? And then at another point, like increasingly we bootstrapped or a mechanism was bootstrapped that took that sequence and started grabbing things from its ambient environment, namely, amino acids, right? And then stitching them together in a new way that was a hypothesis about what to do with that sequence of information that might be useful.
Okay,
right?
so slow down. So this at the conceptual level, we're dealing with the so domain one, and we're now on ribosome, just using an example. Domain one is DNA. Right? So domain one is a particular kind of molecule made up of particular base pairs, which has this a very interesting characteristic. It doesn't do shit by itself. Yeah. All it can do is,
and perhaps it might have just been RNA at the beginning, right?
Yeah, just RNA at the beginning. But right for ribosomal purposes, we're dealing with, well, for whatever. I'm going to use DNA as the example to keep it simple. Remember our example of this sort of parsimony. Eventually, we end up with this molecule DNA that really just does three things well, right? It is what it is. It's able to sort of stay its isness quite effectively. It can copy itself.
Yeah, like the crystalline property.
Yeah, the crystalline property is very stable. Right? You can DNA is quite robustly stable over long periods of time in multiple different environments. Yet it can also copy itself, which is quite a specific break with its stability in an orderly fashion. And it has the ability to be in a larger milieu, the epigenetic context, that allows.
What do you mean? What do you mean by it can copy itself? Just I want
to. DNA can be there's the notion of replication from DNA to DNA. The information encoded in DNA can be copied to another strand of DNA through an orderly process. That is,
through yeah, it can be used to copy itself.
Yes, it can be used to copy itself. It can be part of an orderly process that copies itself, and that orderly process maintains the fidelity of something about the nature of what is being encoded in it, right? So this is what's happening in domain one. And notice there's an interesting mapping there to the notion of what's going on at the level of, let's just use the water wheel, in terms of parsimony, simplicity. Like there's something, and you're saying there's something particularly, let's call it notable or useful or singular in universe of this characteristic of storing a particular configuration.
Yeah.
And being able to replicate that configuration with high fidelity. Right? So
being able to drive, like a sequence, being able to drive a process that is sufficiently regular and resistant to error that one of its byproducts can be a copy of the sequence, or
yes, very nice, very nice. And then we have this crazy as fuck thing that goes on, and where we're now going to take a completely different domain, proteins, which are ultimately molecular, right, in that sense, but they're not the same kind of thing. And we're gonna create a new kind of process, the ribosome, that's actually able to convert, like the water wheel, transform from the first domain, the DNA domain, across itself, using its to open up a new set of affordances, which is now the assemblage of proteins, which of course gives rise to the category of phenotype or of organism, physical organism.
Yeah. And like functional exploration. Yeah.
Functional exploration, right? Because now you can start looking at a wide variety of different things that are going on in protein space that are simply not available in DNA space, and this gives rise to that, ultimately, well, the diversity of characteristics happening in biological organisms.
Like this is that emergence aspect, because to some extent, like there's an implicit understanding, or there's an implicit encoding of the emergent conformations of the protein in the DNA. But it's not actually in the DNA, right? The DNA has to be expressed in combination with the laws of the universe, such that the actual folding that is entailed brings itself into relation with itself in ways that are actually non-trivial to predict. We've thrown a ton of effort, computation, and decades of theoretical work at this. Still haven't solved it. And it's one of the hardest problems being, to which AI is currently being applied as well.
Yep.
And we're making significant progress. But yeah, I mean, it's a very non-trivial point that lifting is not that it enables highly non-deterministic or highly difficult to predict spaces or possible functions, right? And then it's in that space of very difficult to predict functions that the actual nuances of what was encoded in the sequence is realized and sort of parsed in the world of function.
Yeah,
which is a much crazier and harder to like. It's a much more informationally intractable, or as someone like Wolfram would say, computationally irreducible domain, right? Yeah.
And I'm noticing even a certain kind of theoretic skepticism about the ability to talk about the further out affordances. Like those aren't encoded. Like if I say, okay, yes, in some theoretic sense, I can say that a given amino acid is encoded in the DNA, and that we're talking about the level of the ribosome is sort of merely its expression in a new form. Okay, fair enough. But the relationship between, I don't know, like a hummingbird's tongue and the shape of a flower, which is ultimately a fucking expression of that phenotypic exploration, is definitely not encoded in the DNA, right? That's actually a thing that it lives entirely in conformation space, available exclusively as a result of the affordances of what's happening on the other side of the protein transition.
Which is contingent on the transformations also in the external environment, right? Which is we're especially coming to realize in terms of all the different ways in terms of which genetic expression has variance as well in context dependent manner.
Right. Okay. So now we're getting another a good theme. So let's pull that theme forward. You have like in class 1. So here now we're talking about the example of class 1 is the ribosome. The fundamental function that it provides is, how would I describe this? I mean, I want to say it's almost like geometric in nature. Like it's a unique characteristic in reality that is available. Like it's a special case problem that it's solving. Then in class 2, we're now entering into the problematic of what happens in protein space. That's a very diverse set of different problems it can solve, right? We're looking at the diversity of all possible organisms lives on that side of the equation, right? So it's almost like I have an abstract general class, ribosome, or the DNA to protein, or DNA/RNA to protein synthesis, which is a very, very universal single point. You fucking figure that out, that's kind of done. And it gives rise to literally all variations on the theme. Right? So class 2, explore mode, is saying, oh, sweet, you can regularly take a conserved pattern storage in the form of DNA. You can regularly take that conserved pattern and you can regularly produce proteins. Thank you. Sweet. Now I'm going to figure out what I can do with that. Right. So that's
and like specifically that binding, it doesn't try to internalize complexity of its environment. It does the opposite, like we're talking about. That parsimony is actually the process of it trying to find the most lean connection between those two domains, because in that parsimony, there's fundamentally stability. And insofar as the stability exists as a property, it can actually maximize the duration of exploration on the other side.
Right.
Because if that parsimony doesn't exist and the mechanism is too complex and therefore transient or ephemeral,
right,
you get very little time in which to explore the space on the other side.
Yeah, and so you're describing it in terms of the kind of the utility or the necessity, the more fundamental the characteristics that you're dealing with, the sort of the more possibility for actually discovering things over here. And I can convert it. I can flip it upside down and say that's a design requirement for anything of category 1. And so you're almost always going to be looking for things that are at the most fundamental level of the nature of reality, right? As you said, the thing with
I mean that will if you think of it in terms of a fitness space whose fitness function is trying to understand the length of possible emergent sequences, the degree to which the binding mechanisms that it builds on are fundamental.
Nice.
implies implies a larger sequence length of those sort of emergent oscillations between exploration and encoding, or exploration and binding. So
yes, and I want to reinforce the notion that we're actually talking about a qualitatively different. There's a qualitative difference here, right? And if you could kind of go back to our simpler metaphor, the notion of water wheel is qualitatively distinct from the class of things you can do with water wheels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like the ability to bake the bread is itself non-substitutable, non-fungible with the water wheel.
Right.
Like this was like in Jim and I's conversation, this is idea of like, okay, well, Cardano's doing its thing. If you make this closure in this space, even if it's not bound, doesn't it just become the same thing that the proof of work mechanism is? Isn't it just a substitution at that point? Don't they just become fungible? And my point is that they don't, because one exists inside the possibility envelope, so to speak, of the other. So
and we're do you want to get there? Not yet. Let's get there a little bit, like one more step.
Yeah.
All right. So, by the way, God, those who watch this will tell, but my sense is we're actually doing a pretty good job. I think we're articulating these concepts with a decent amount of like accessibility. All right. Now, I want to make a move at doing one more step between where we've been and where we're going in crypto space. To see if there's like an example that is nice and concrete, that contains more of the elements altogether. But I'm mindful of the fact that this might be not a good choice, like it may be a digression. So just run a second order process here where you're like, this ain't fucking working. We can just pull the plug and jump straight into crypto. And I feel like a good place to go is in the emergence of culture.
Mm-hmm.
Let me tell you the story the way I understand it. We're now further afield. We've gone from chemistry into life. We've gone from life into anima, or life that has behavior. And now we're right at the binding, or the emergent domain between behavior and culture. Right? So in behavior space, I've got all the animals. I've got very simple animals that have very simple input output. But what I mean by behavior, I mean, you and I have this, but let's just make it very clear. I have effectively an input and output state space where there's a connection between some diversity of inputs and some diversity of outputs. That's what I'm talking about by behavior, right? So it's not I can have the input, sense gradient of energy, and I can have the output move in that direction. Now, that's a behavior. Not everything in the universe has behaviors. Rocks don't do that. Animals, and to an extent, plants do. Okay. If I look at my giant field of all the different kinds of behaviors, I begin to notice that sort of over here in the top right quadrant, I'm making that up, like I'm just using that as a visual metaphor. There's a class of behaviors that we would characterize as social behaviors, right? Where the input state, let's go with like, I don't know, a pack of dogs. The input state of my behavior is observing the output state of behaviors of other organisms that I've identified as being particularly interesting. In this case, other members of my pack. Right. And so the animal can output a growl. That growl has a certain affordance to my perception. I input that growl. I know that growl means be submissive. And so I can output submissive behavior. Right. So now I have it's sitting on top of the substrate of behavior is this category of a particular kind of behavior, social behavior. All right, you ready? So now we're exploring in the overall space of social behavior. We start getting these particular kinds of organisms, which are hominids, that have very large spaces of inputs and outputs, lots of complexity in the interior of what they do. Right, so they start building the ability. Now we're going to get to an interesting place where there's a regularity of output, in this case, particularly language, which has a novel characteristic. I'm trying to get this like in real time. So help me if I'm either missing it or if you feel like you can grab it and make it more concrete. Which maybe is akin, maybe is actually isomorphically a mapping to the characteristic of DNA, meaning there's a regularity of verbal expression, right? We're not just dealing with growls and barks and yips. We're actually dealing with, hey, if I always say this, if I utter this sound with this tool I have, the larynx and lips and mouth, and it sounds like this, look out. there's a regularity, the ability to create that particular transformation and a regularity to it that begins to afford a whole new set of things that can happen, right? It opens up a whole category. That language, for example, by hypothesis, is a binding closure of the sort that we are describing, and it moves us from behavior space into culture space. All right, does that work? Is it?
So I think there's a lot of fascinating questions in like that are lying within that whole stack of ideas. And I guess perhaps one. So I've talked about a similar idea in the idea or in the concept or under the heading of something I've written as sort of emergent biocultural encoding, right? And it relates to what we're talking about in the sense that this stack that we're talking about of oscillations between exploratory uses of prior binding closures such that they can then be re-encapsulated and then brought down into a parsimonious novel foundation that can then be once again used to extend that pattern. I think if you look at social phenomenon, if you look at our embodied being, the embodied individual being, think about all of the processes that have to metabolically function to give rise to our ability to even have an understanding of an outside awareness of things happening around us. All of those internal processes that are in that same, so you mentioned when you're discussing this possibility, the fact that we can actually pay attention to the outputs of other entities like us as part of this functional behavioral space. And that can be quite loose in the sense that we're at the edge of the forefront of this whole process of trying to explore possible relations. But inside of our body, inside of ourselves, all of those, all of the mechanisms that are paying attention to other mechanisms are in quite tight relation, right? Like they don't have any degrees of freedom because it's the end point of this entire sequence of processes that have explored, discovered closures that could, in theory, continue that binding gradient,
Right.
And then brought them into much more deterministic internal relation, right? But then at the edge of that, we are recapitulating that exploratory process. And this is where this interesting question comes into being in terms of, is language, the emergence of language itself, does it fall into that sort of class 1 or class 2 type of behavior? I would like, my intuition is that the emergence of language itself is more of a class 2 initial exploratory phenomenon that is built upon a combination of a number of our own affordances, like the ability to pass air through our trachea, our mouth, over our tongue, modulate that, the ability to actually pick that up as well, to create loops between that. And then we started playing with regularity, probably things like song, chant, before even like discrete simulable mapping. And then I think, interestingly enough, when it became sufficiently useful to and predictable and translatable, we codified it into something that became much more like a binding closure through writing. I think that might be like projecting it into sequential. What?
I'm going to disagree with that. My sense is that there's the, so let's say almost like Chomsky grammar, or the particulars of sort of language as an abstraction, and then language as particulars. So if you look at it, like every child is sort of loaded with the affordance to learn an oral language, and then it learns a particular oral language as such. And there's pretty strong evidence that all languages have a very finite set of fundamental characteristics, and that by the way, I'm
saying, like, at our current location as humans, some elements of that linguistic faculty may have been migrated or pushed into the biostack, so to speak, more into that the sort of tightly coupled inertial frame that is more dictated by whatever comes out of the lifting of process or function from the genetic encoding, right? Like there may very well be relations in that genetic encoding, and it's still debated. The
Sure.
generative grammar hypothesis is still sort of like it's open, but there's a lot of interesting intuition there. So like part of that may very well be moved down into that domain of parsimony. Although that domain of parsimony is also the top of that stack is way less parsimonious and way less fixed, than the deeper elements of that stack, than like the mitochondrial level of that stack.
Sure.
Yeah,
so the way you're saying it reminds me. So let me try to say it again, somewhat clearly, because I think the way you're describing it gives a nice compactness. Like Homo sapiens, at the level of like looking backwards towards mitochondria, like looking in the direction of the kind of highly parsimonious, highly conserved chain of stacks, ambiently produces language past a certain threshold. Like at some point in the evolutionary process, there's suddenly the organism that produces language regularly and ambiently. Once that exists,
it's like those tones, our capacity for tonality, right? Like that could be the analog could be something like protein space, right? And we start playing in that space.
And we start playing in that space. Now, what happens in that space, though, because now we're well above behavior, right? We're well past where behavior is. What happens is you get this feedback loop where these regular expressions start being able to modulate behaviors. Of course, that's what culture is, right? Culture is where the regular expressions of phenomena that are happening produced by humans that are not part of natural behavior, but this new category, let's say language, or other various artifacts that are produced in that fashion, modulate behavior in a conserved, like if you get an exploratory closure, right? You get a variation on the theme, what's emergent on top of that. And I think when I say language, I actually mean the sort of neurocognitive physiological capacity to regularly produce symbols of any.
Okay, I think I see. Like, let me know if this is what you're thinking or like pointing to, because I think I see what you're pointing to now. Because I think what you're getting at is like, to the extent that a consistently transmissible linguistic lineage, or what we call a language, right? Like that you would see, in English versus Mandarin, for example, like that in and of itself is a kind of culturally emergent binding closure, given that it enables, even without writing, the ability to reproduce the states that enable regular transmission of simulable information about the environment. Is that right? Kind of?
Yeah, and so what you have is like the thing that gave rise to that over here. So I'm just going to call that language, or symbolic expression is probably a better term. Regular symbolic expression, and then over here I have now the explore mode of all the particular variations on that theme that are going out and saying, okay, well, Mandarin, for example, gives rise to one particular set of cultural affordances, roughly equivalent to grinding flour. And English gives rise to a different set of cultural affordances, roughly equivalent to, I don't know, sawmill. And they're all sort of sitting on top of the basic capacity to engage in regular symbolic expression. And what holds them together is the characteristics of what's available within the entire space of symbolic cultural expression, and the way that they're playing with that potential. Okay. What?
I mean, I guess I kind of encoded that encode that in the sentiment that's similar to like the pinned tweet on my Twitter account right now, which is something to the effect of this aspect of humanity that enables us to observe continuous processes, and then to some extent create a discrete closure, symbolic closure around some predictable set of observations that can itself act as that coupling, almost like in the way that we like bind energy and sugar. This abstract discrete unit of a word can be used to encapsulate some, not fully, not wholly, not perfectly, but with sufficient predictability and regularity, some aspect of the external world that we might want to use in the ingredients of our social simulations, so that we can co-process or coordinate behavior using information about places and times that aren't actually in the interaction space.
Yeah. Okay. So now we're, I think, ready to move on to that last category.
Okay.
or whatever's
Yeah.
going on.
I mean, language is definitely fundamental to that.
Well, yeah, and all the words that you're describing, with the notion of coordination, the notion
Yeah.
of, and I'm in my mind thinking about, okay, well, what is this notion of like the principle of parsimony? Well,
Yeah.
what does it look like to think about like what's a parsimonious culture?
Yeah. And like fun, like that, definitely that. And not like fundamentally, this distinction between like when we introduce the interesting thing about introducing the linguistic encodings is that, and like by nature of their imperfect mapping, right? By nature of the fact that we are generating them in a way that is definitely not arbitrary, but has quite a bit of flexibility, not only in terms of how we produce them initially, but also how we combine them and the extent to which that has a symmetry with reality or not.
Yep.
That's a property of linguistic or symbolic representation that is not a feature of the sort of genetic gene to protein space lift, right? That is just an entailed phenomenon, even if it's not fully predictable. It's an entailed set of phenomena that is lifted by a mechanism. There's this one-to-one mapping between sequence and conformation, right? That is just it's not intermediated by something that is introducing interpretation or subjectivity.
Yeah.
Right. But when we're talking about information, there's it would be almost as if the ribosome could be sneaky, right? Or the ribosome could start having self-interest.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. It's very difficult to do the mapping across.
It quite literally gets twisted. Into itself topologically. But I think we can definitely do it.
Yeah, well, to the point, right? So this is very, very much okay. So this is nice, actually. I think you've just introduced some of the right questions. So, in the field of culture space, we have a wide variety of potentials, right? Again, mapping to the notion of the water wheel. We've got all kinds of different. You can grind different things. We can assemble different things. Okay, cool. Wide variety of affordances. We have within that set of affordances, we have a particular problem, at least one, which is, as you say, there's ways of playing with language or ways of playing with symbolic expression that produce twistings. Right? You can lie, you can deceive, you can manipulate. Right? There's all those different things that can be done that are unconstrained or not adequately constrained simply by the characteristics that we've so far discovered in the context of culture space. And we notice, by the way, that this is a primary problematic that all cultures ultimately deal with, right? It's the defection problem. Like, how do you...
And like we could also use a lot of the language if you want. I mean, you or even just to think about it, you can port these ideas of transformations mathematically directly into that, because it gives us the ability to do things like scale, like exaggerate, right? Or to twist, or to rotate, right?
We can do counterfactuals, right? We can engage in a whole variety of functions as a fitness enhancing capacity of this characteristic. And there's a whole
because we're simultaneously not only aware of the input of the sequence, but also aware of the potential relevance of its contextual application.
Okay.
While we're in the process of putting it back out into the world, right? Not only am I aware of what I'm seeing, I'm aware of how what I'm about to say about what I'm seeing might generate new behavior.
Okay, so then just to do a little bit of a rough, like a gentle mapping, is to use the comparison, I can take a look at the sort of the space of all possible ribosomes. And of course, for some period of time, there were ribosomes that introduced their own errors into the translation function. And as we discovered, the way that evolution works is that just got fucking extinguished. Right, ribosomes.
It can still happen, but we have error correction mechanism stuff. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's to a pretty good place.
It had to reach the most the most fit, which is to say the most adaptive conformation of how the ribosome thing does what it does, right? In the context of the larger environment that it's operating in. And that's in many ways a way of, I'm just saying that because that's many ways of describing what's been going on in history, which is the search space of culture, trying to figure out what culture is all about. And so there's cultures that have a very high degree of exploration of like fiction and making shit up. There's cultures that actually have a relatively low version of that, right? And there's cultures that engage in all kinds of variations of a wide variety of different things in the possibility space of what culture can do. And okay, And by hypothesis, we may be dealing with something where we're looking for a binding closure at the edge of culture space, in much the same way that again, in the hypothesis that I'm introducing, something like symbolic expression, language, broadly construed, is a binding closure from behavior space into culture space and gave rise to the opening up of culture space for exploration mode. We may be at a moment where we're actually looking for something like a binding closure between culture space and some other kind of emergent space. And now I'm going to introduce the combination now, by the way, but I do both. Let's start with just blockchain or whatever we want to call that fucking thing. And maybe we'll introduce large language models just because it's crazy. Let's just start with proof of work. So to use the language, and I've been playing with this in my head. I think I'm wrong, but there's some interesting ideas that come out here. So one, we're in this model, we're making a hypothesis that there is going to be a binding closure category, and we're proposing that proof of work is it for reasons. We'll describe why. And that there's something like an explore closure category, or I can't remember what the language was used to describe it at the beginning, of which we're proposing the proof of stake may be, in fact, that kind of thing. All right. In the context of proof of work, we've got concepts like fundamental, we've got concepts like parsimony, we've got concepts like predictability, durability, that are sort of design constraints that we can project on what might be the right answer to the question of what binding closure looks like in this category. Right? So that's I think, a proper way of thinking about it now. We've got a pretty developed language. We've noticed in the past that some very fundamental things in the universe, like energy, and in the current environment, I'm going to propose computation, which is to say a particular form of regular, like ribosome in its most abstract. Like you can look at computation as being the ultimate abstraction of what ribosome is doing. And you can look at the notion of just energy in its most fundamental sense and say, what would happen if I glued those two things together in a mutually conducive way and put them in the context of how culture operates? Right? So here's the hypothesis. I have basically a triangle. If I look at the way that proof of work has been designed, I have an arms race, which is culture competing with other cultures on the basis of their capacity to coordinate and innovate. Right? I have an arms race in energy space. I have whoever can figure out how to get the most efficient use of or the highest supply of cheap, and the word cheap here is important, right? Because cheap has to do with the use of cultural capacities to produce changes in reality. So I'm looking at, on the one left-hand side of the equation, I'm trying to get the most cheap energy, and on the right-hand side of the equation, I'm trying to get the most efficient use of energy to produce computation. Right? So those are kind of the two things I just stuck together in the context of proof of work. And notice how I'm implicating culture in that. Right? So I'm saying, hey, culture, I'm giving you a task. You're now set to engage in a maximal conflict. Whoever can figure out, by whatever means necessary, the cultural coordination structure that can combine to get either the most energy or the cheapest energy and the most efficient computation, and the combination of that gets to win this particular very specifically defined how to describe it? I'm going to say game, but what I mean is a set of criteria. Right? Back to the water wheel. Right? I'm actually identifying something like an abstract description of an optimal constraint space on cultures competing with each other to solve the problematic of energy and computation. And that's sort of what I'm describing as what proof of work ultimately at the ground actually is.
I think, yeah. So this is there's the sort of isness of it, and there's the whyness of it. And I think to some extent, the just to add some color on the why part of it as well. I mostly agree on the is part, and we should definitely further explore that. But to color in the why, I think one thing we can't, because it begs, or the question is raised, what is it about the competition in culture space that makes something valuable that could provide or provision a kind of regular baseline or constraint on the possible expressions, right? Or the way those possible expressions could be used to mediate behavior. And this is where we get back into this question of using symbols to represent extrinsic reality or some aspect of reality with fidelity or without fidelity. And especially if it's not being represented with fidelity for a purpose, especially the purpose of manipulation, right? Because you start then getting into the question of an unbound space of expression. I would make the argument will tend to undermine itself through the dominance of parasitic behavior, parasitic usage of expression, right? Because if there's nothing to bind that expression, there can be local utility, an unbounded local utility in using the expressive capacity to manipulate others in ways that don't aggregate into any greater or any that don't aggregate into stable function as a lineage, as something that's trying to, at a larger scale, move itself through time. As well as explore its own possibility space so that it doesn't incur catastrophe itself.
So what I think I heard you say is something like a native characteristic of what happens in culture space is that all of the various forms of I guess I don't want to keep saying closure because I'm not sure if I'm actually using it correctly here, but all the different forms of, closure, self-reproducing uses of symbolic expression, coordination structures, etc., have parasitism wired in as a potential risk, right? Culture will always have that as a risk. All right, now, and I think, let me just expand from that because I'm pretty sure I know where that leads.
Yeah. And also like autoparasitism, like the capacity of self-undermining parasitism to emerge from within the actual culture itself. Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Which we're experiencing beyond comprehension in Western civilization as we currently are experiencing it. And the kind of the point or the payload of that is, and we can reference some of the language we've used in the past of like this notion of a stack or a chain, is that the more you want this closure to hold, the deeper in the stack it needs to go. All right. So, and you said this very particularly in your conversation with Jim. It's like, well, okay, the notion of proof of stake is ultimately grounding itself within the phenomenology of human behavior. And that's its grounding ultimately ends at the way that our current best understanding of how game theory works in the context of humans. Right. And okay, maybe like that's might be strong. I don't know. Could be. Why do I have
it's a necessary hypothesis, necessary hypothesis space for us to explore.
Sure, real good.
But it is definitely not guaranteed to find consonance with that stack.
I kind of got to shrug my shoulders about it though, because like, look, fair enough. It's only at best 1 million years old. Like even if I want to just use a very simple measure, if my basic principle is the deeper in the stack, in some sense, the better in terms of how much you want this thing to hold, I can guarantee you that human behavior and game theory is much shallower in the stack than energy and computation. Right. So if I really want to build a solid foundation for a binding closure between culture space and some other kind of thing, a whole new layer in this big stack, what I'd like to do is I'd like to put those pillars, those pins, all the way down to the basic substrate of reality as well as we can understand it, which is in fact the union or the location of where information and energy and the notion of intelligence lives. Right? That's my triad. I got information, energy, and intelligence, exploring information and energy space. If I can get those three things and bind something on that, I've got a really, really comparatively, who knows how many orders of magnitude higher degree of confidence that I have a truly binding closure that can hold culture so that I can then step into this new category. And by the way, as you said, like the size or the length, the chain length, in some sense, like the volume of the new space that I'm opening up is sort of strictly determined by the depth or the strength of the binding closure that I'm using to open it up. And so I can actually now say pretty categorically, not perfectly, I don't get geometric proof on this, but I get a really good fucking heuristic that something that is premised on Homo sapiens in game theory is almost certainly less fundamental by giant orders of magnitude than something that is premised on energy, information, and intelligence. That's sort of like my version of the argument in this model. I want to step. Okay, that's the end. Let me step back to the notion of is, because I feel like I said something and you agreed with me on the is, but I don't know that it was particularly clear from outside of our two heads.
So yeah, I mean, we should definitely explore it for sure, right? In the sense that this question of is in terms of the binding and like I definitely want to, especially on the computation side of that, explore a bit more and perhaps come into greater consonance between us in terms of our perspectives. Because to some extent, like when we talk also about computation happening fundamentally down that stack, we have to ask ourselves about the nature of computation and to what extent is that an artifact of top-down design from our perspective, right? Because is what, like if you characterize nature as performing computation before we've ever existed, there's an interesting question as to how similar that is with the kind of computation we perform using computers, for example. And all I'm saying is that, like, I think there are definitely ways for logical relations to what we call logical relations, causal relations, to work themselves out or manifest themselves across different orders of emergent function. Without anything that without our addition of the formalisms of computation. But when we introduce logic to the mix, what we call logic, logic, if you look at the history of the evolution of the concept, is the human attempt to try to get to the root of the simplest causal relations in our observable environment. And then we built infrastructure to emulate or simulate that kind of relational structure. And we have certain, Church's thesis and certain other proofs in terms of, Turing's work in terms of what it means to be able to arbitrarily simulate. That's an interesting question itself. The only reason I'm bringing this up is because I do think that, like, what we're getting at when we're trying to get at the combination of energy and computation is we're trying to bring together an emulation of the fundamental causal structure that bootstraps all of emergent complexity in the universe itself, right? Like, because, like, presumably there's some gradient that drives the thing, and there's some logic that constrains the thing. And then those together give rise to this entire entailment cone of emergence that we find ourselves at the end of today. So when I hear you talking, that's what I think you're saying. Does that jive with what you're getting at?
Very much so. Sadly, I have to jump to a call with well, not sad, but I have to jump to a call with John Vervaeke in 10 minutes. And I want to make
that's not sad at all.
No, it's not sad at all. But the fact that we have to end this conversation is sad, and that's how the nature of life. All right, so let's see.
All good things.
All right, so let me just respond a little bit to what you just said, and then I want to add the sort of the AI piece on as the cherry on top, because I think it helps. Conceptually, I've been consistently frustrated by the how would I say, the sort of the Brobdingnagian level of conceptualization around blockchain thus far. Right, it's definitely not money. Right, it's definitely not about money. It's something that is my proposition is substantially more profound than that, and we may not even have an effective way of expressing that yet. In just the same way, the DNA can't talk about hummingbirds. Right? So
it's also reflected in our understanding, like in the fact that we don't understand that money's not about money either.
Yeah. Okay. So right. Exactly. All right. So computation. Yes. The description, what we described with regard to the transformation of what a ribosome does, right? The ability to conserve pattern while moving through media is computation. Right? Computation is exactly that, right? The notion of being able to play with the affordances of distinct media while biasing towards the constraints of pattern is computation. So nature does computation as an ambient thing all over the place. And then energy, right? So energy we're good with. We're pretty okay with that as sort of a thing. Computation I'm proposing is also effectively a primitive. And what we're exploring as humanity in the context, for example, of computers, quad computers, in particular the movement, say, from analog computers to digital computers and from application specific to general purpose, is the ephemeralization or the purification of the category of computation into its most abstract and most simple fundamental form. Right? So we're moving along a vector, sort of separating out like, oh shit, yeah, computation just has nothing to do with, say, Babbage machines and the particular kind of the sort of metallurgic characteristics. Like, that's not computation. Like, oh, computation has nothing to do with vacuum tubes. Computation has nothing to do, so what is it? Like, we're moving further and further towards the edge of sort of its most abstract essence of isness. So that's what I'm going to propose as we're doing that. And then I'm going to go back to my sort of little triangle. What we have in the category of proof of work is we have sort of yoked together a competitive exploration. Again, this is sort of the nature of how culture does what it does, is it does competitive collaboration, a competitive collaborative exploration of the space of that ephemeralization of computation, and of more and more exploration of finding the most potent affordances of energy. And we're using them to produce this new thing up here, right? Which is a sort of what are the characteristics that we notice, right? We notice characteristics of immutability. We notice characteristics of transparency, right? We notice characteristics within the context of immutability, the characteristics of tamper resistance, right? There's a bunch of new affordances, just like our water wheel, like a whole bunch of new affordances that are translated from this most fundamental dynamic into this new landscape. And the question, of course, I'm going to turn it this way so I have more room to work with.
And then the newest one is reflexive encoding, which is another interesting property.
What do you mean?
So the sort of inscriptions or ordinals question, right? The ability to not only have that be to exhibit the properties you're describing, but also to allow for reflexive impression based on that functional space, to then observe the capacity of the code or the underlying binding closure to accommodate some finite amount of encodings about the behavior of itself or about the behavior of the world around it. Right?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to throw out there. So I guess maybe what we'll do is we'll run into we'll switch into high explore mode. I think there's actually a really powerful or triple union between what's happening in LLM space and what's happening in proof of work space, particularly including the notion of ordinals. And it has, let's see. So one is if I look at like, what are the risk factors of what I'm dealing with in trying to actually have my strength of binding hold? And I'm definitely looking at AGI, right? I need a binding closure that is strong enough to deal with a fucking GI, right? I'm not talking about like 19 guys who are sort of trying to puppet master Cardano. I'm talking about AGI trying to manipulate what's going on in its substrate. I need something that's strong enough to bind against that, right? So that's one.
And I would argue fundamentally through the lens of autoparasitic tendency, right?
Yeah, exactly, right? Yeah. I'm putting that out there. It's like, if I look at my sort of portfolio of ways to deal with the threat vector of AI or AGI on the context of culture space, one of the things I've got out there is the binding closure that's embodied in proof of work is actually, I think, one of the key things we're going to be working with. Mm-hmm. Two, if I look at if I want to sort of, how do I say this right? If I want to find out what happens if I evolve all possible LLMs in the explore mode dynamic, okay, what I begin to discover is there's something like the evolutionary function that is exposed in ordinal space becomes the fitness landscape against which LLMs are actually being selected against. And let me say it in a slightly different way.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
The most singular true symbols are ultimately what's going to be sorted for in ordinal space, right? Because either bogus symbols or
as functionally expressed, right?
Yeah, it
Because
has to.
that's the really, I mean, and this is why I kind of like liken exploratory, emergent exploration to a minesweeper problem as well, because of the fact that
Yeah,
there are mines on that landscape. And the reason for the depth of that anchor in my high level analysis is to reduce the probability of running into those mines in function space, right? Because remember, function space is not predictable from encoding space. And so we actually have to act out the function space exploration, and that introduces risk. This is what we talk about as X risk. And the X risk of AGI, or I would call like synthetic general intelligence, as an extension of our ability to synthesize computation. If we just run that experiment, it will discover the most parasitic relationships to its substrate, and it's likely to undercut them, right? Without constraints. And I think that's kind of why you're putting your finger on something like an ordinal space anchored into this deeper binding closure stack as a constraint, not just a nice to have constraint, but perhaps an existentially mandated constraint if we do not wish for this to be terminal.
Yeah. Okay. So let's end there. And I just want to like do the thing where this is so funny, right? You and I think, are largely in agreement that the last couple of paragraphs are in fact the case. Right. So it's funny. There's actually I'll put it this way. There was a scene in the trailer to the movie Oppenheimer that I just happened to watch like a couple of hours ago. Mm-hmm. And there's some guy, maybe it's Enrico Fermi, I'm not quite sure. He's like, why the fuck do I need to go to the desert to engage in this? And Matt Damon's character, who I suppose is, I can't remember his name right now, but the general who was Oppenheimer's partner, he's like, because this is the most fucking important thing in the history of the world, right? He said it with emotion.
Yeah. No, I just watched it yesterday. That was definitely probably the most powerful, or one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful part of that trailer. At least for me,
we're more or less proposing that while there are many important things going on, this very specific question that we've been discussing at the tail end here is very high on the stack of most important things going on in the world right now, right? And I would like that to be checked, right? I don't want to waste my time on what's a false, self-deception's a problem. But if it's actually true, I would also like it to be considered more broadly by more intelligent people than me. All right.
Manhattan Project worthy.
Maximum cringe whenever that's referenced. But yeah, exactly. All right, man.
All right. That was a great conversation with John, and this was wonderful. Hopefully it helps people, and I know it's helped me further understand my own thoughts. So hopefully you got something out of it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Till next time.
Peace, man.